Hello, everybody. I'm Chris Painter. I'd like to welcome you all to our session today on ransomware as a transporter crime. We have a great group of panelists, and I think this will be a very interesting discussion. I would like to, I'll be their moderator today, as I said. A couple things I wanted to say before we begin. First, big thanks to the Institute for Security and Technology for hosting this event today. IST is a nonprofit, nonpartisan network based in the Bay Area, dedicated to bridging the security policymakers and tech innovators to advance solutions for the world's toughest security threats. We have more events to come, and so we thank you all for participating. I should also say that IST has helped found a ransomware task force to deal with this very tough problem with a lot of experts from around the world who are focused on these issues and trying to come up with actionable recommendations. Personally, I'd say that in my experience, although a lot of attention is paid to some of the nation state attacks and intrusions that we've seen over the last few years, ransomware has caused, I think, enough damage both economically and also in terms of disruption of critical services, and has the potential to do so, that it really rises now, I think, to the level of a national security and economic level, and it's important for us to have these discussions. As I said, I'm Chris Painter. My background is I am currently the president of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. This is a worldwide capacity building foundation. I previously was the US's top and first cyber diplomat. Before that, I did many things, including for a long time being a prosecutor of cybercrime back in the early days and into the middle days, I guess. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves. So let me first turn to Jaya.
Always sticky, that unmute button. My name is Jaya Baloo. I'm the Chief Information Security Officer at Avast, which is based out of the Czech Republic, but I'm based out of the Netherlands because I used to be the former CISO of KPN.
Great. Philip?
Same problem here. Well, first of all, thanks for having me, Philippe Aman, the head of strategy of the European Cybercrime Center, a part of Europol. Before that, worked for a number of different international organizations and also financial sector. Technically based in the Netherlands, currently based, speaking out of Vienna, Austria. Thank you.
Great. And finally, Josephine.
Hi, I'm Josephine Wolf. I'm an assistant professor of cybersecurity policy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. So I'm in the Boston area right now.
Great. Well, it's great to have you all here today. And just to tee up our discussion, modern financial crimes like ransomware present novel challenges for attribution and remediation. Whereas more traditional physical crimes like bank robbery have a clear time, place, and set of actors, a ransomware attack may utilize infrastructure in a number of different countries, involve threat actors that reside across the globe. So truly a transnational type of crime, like many cyber crimes are. So what we're going to discuss today is how we can address ransomware as a cross-border crime. How can we do that? This panel will discuss questions of attribution and accountability with international ransomware threat actors and the so-called safe haven problem of where they may try to at least avoid scrutiny and explore ways that we can solve these issues to the extent that can be done. And look at both diplomatic and operational solutions to mitigate the growing ransomware threat, which, as I said, is becoming a real national and economic security problem. So with that, let me start the questioning, and I'm going to turn first to Josephine. And I mentioned this term safe haven. What does that really mean in this context? What makes a country safe havens? Is there a distinction between different countries? Or, that some countries maybe are willing safe havens and some are not willing safe havens? And how can we, with the fact that these safe havens exist, how can we actually go after the bad guys? How can we break this down and try to get to the people who are in these safe havens? How can we influence them or maybe change their actions at a state level as well?
Great question. So I think there are really two things that I think about as contributing to a country being a place where ransomware criminals feel totally secure in what they're doing and not afraid of arrest or any kind of crackdown. And one is a really lax regime around cryptocurrencies and cryptocurrency exchanges, where criminals feel that there's no risk that anybody's going to be tracking too closely how much money they're taking out of those exchanges or where that money comes from or where it's going. And the other part, which is often sort of closely linked to that, is a real unwillingness on the part of the country's government to cooperate with international law enforcement investigations in these types of crimes. And I think, we can see a lot of very clear examples of that, where law enforcement in various countries have been able to identify individuals who are behind large-scale ransomware schemes and groups, but have not been able to get the cooperation of, say, the Russian government to help them actually arrest those individuals. And so I think those are the two pieces that I would highlight, sort of the cryptocurrency piece and then the cooperation around cybercrime investigations. And in countries where both of those things are true, then we see a lot of very lucrative ransomware happening based on those two criteria. And I think the question of sort of what are some of the differences? Is everybody a willing safe haven? I would say at this point in 2021, probably yes. Probably most of the countries where this is really big have had enough time to be aware that this is something that is going on, to be aware of the opportunities for trying to make it harder or to cooperate with international organizations on these investigations, and have decided for a variety of reasons that that's not what they want to do. And I would just highlight a couple different reasons we see. One is financial, right? There are some countries where either the government itself is directly trying to profit from ransomware. North Korea is probably the most obvious example of this. So it's like a revenue generator for the government. There are also countries where the economic impacts are perhaps a little more indirect, where it's just an important economic driver, where a lot of people are making a lot of money and maybe even paying taxes on that money. And then the other motivation that we see is that there's some overlap in some places where there are kind of criminal groups operating the ransomware, but sharing some of the access they gain, sharing some of the information and intelligence that they might come across in the process of doing that with the government, and therefore providing some sort of peripheral benefits to their governments. And that all of those can sort of contribute in different places to why countries might decide they didn't want to crack down, they didn't want to cooperate with other groups and other countries on trying to make it harder for people to conduct ransomware.
So you think it's, you said that you think most of these governments are knowing, they know this is happening. They're not, there's an argument that a lot of countries just don't have the capabilities. They don't have the trained law enforcement. They don't have the resources. This is not something prioritized. But you think it's mostly the former, the countries who know this is going on and just have no interest in helping.
I think the biggest ones, yes, that would be my instinct. I'm sure there are some exceptions to that. I would also say, I think sort of on the cooperation side, there are certainly countries where the issue is not only that they may not have the resources themselves, but also that they're not willing to sort of cooperate with or share any of the resources that are being offered to them by international organizations. And so I'm inclined to think that that is a deliberate choice, even if it's not necessarily that they could do this all themselves, not being willing to work with other people and work with other countries. I think at this point, after we've seen this many years of ransomware, to me seems like a sort of decision that you're going to be on the other side.
Well, and interestingly, I know from when I was a prosecutor, this is not a new issue, right? I mean, ransomware is relatively new, but these safe havens have happened for a long time, or have been there for a long time. I think some have been broken down by countries really putting some positive pressure on the countries, not just countries, but companies too, saying we'll invest in you, we'll do more if you take care of this problem. Some of the Eastern European countries, I think, went through a little bit of this. Is there any hope here? I mean, is there any positive way that we can maybe get around, either get these safe havens to actually cooperate, or failing that, just do something to make sure we get those criminals in any event?
I think there is some hope. I think that if we can make ransomware less lucrative, and there are a variety of ways of thinking about doing that, trying to impose more penalties on people who pay ransoms, trying to think about sort of, can we do a better job at regulating cryptocurrencies globally, then at least some of these countries will lose interest or feel that it's just not worth trying to continue to, however indirectly, support this as an industry in their country. So I am inclined to think there's some hope. I do think there's more hope in the sort of question of what can other like-minded countries who all sort of together collectively oppose ransomware, what can they do to make it harder for this to come in from other countries? And there, I think we've seen some really hopeful examples of what's possible. I think, the Operation Tovar takedown of Game Over Zeus, where you see a really sort of large-scale, sophisticated effort to block access to international servers where there's not cooperation, and sort of think about how do we leverage all of the legal tools, all of the technical tools, is a sort of good model, and we've seen other examples since then. But it's certainly a lot harder when you don't have those governments on your side.
All right, well, I'm sure I'll have more questions for you in the context of this about how we might be able to pressure those governments and other issues. But let me turn now to Phil. And I should say, we want to make this a conversation. I'll ask an initial question of each person, but other panelists should feel free to jump in and comment on the questions that other folks were asked too. But let me turn to Phil. Phil, ransomware actors, by their nature, they're using infrastructure in different countries. So especially from your perspective, how can you go after these? How can you do disruptive activities that will stop them when you have a number of countries involved, the infrastructure is a number of countries? How can you do something that I think Europol has been very good at, which is trying to marshal resources to do these international takedowns among different countries, working with both countries and different law enforcement agencies in those countries? And are there any good precedents for going forward based on what's happened in the past?
Thanks, Chris. Really good points. And I think, well, Josephine actually, I think, touched upon some really good points already. I think, it comes, it's quite easy. What you need to have is that coalition, that cooperation, that coordination internationally to go after those groups, and to do the technical takedown, to do the attribution, follow the financial transactions, and also do something about the victims. And I think that's where I think at Europol EC3 we've been very good at, if you will, applying the platform economy to law enforcement. We're here to support member states. We're here to support countries with whom we have an operation agreement, such as the US or Canada or Australia. And this is where I think that comes to fruition, that we've been able, I think, to create that trust environment and to create those incentives for all the actors to engage. And that's by no means just law enforcement. Yes, it's hugely important to have law enforcement cooperation, within, throughout the EU, but also with the US, with other countries, and maybe, go through other countries to talk to countries that maybe are not as cooperative as other countries. So I think there are many ways there, but really, I think what it is using that, creating that network of the willing and the able to do something about it. And I think, this is challenging in itself, because again, it's not just law enforcement, it's industry, it's academia, it's the CISO community. All of them need to come together, provide, the missing puzzle pieces of the puzzle, and need to be willing to engage and really, move the needle, walk the talk, as it were. And I think that's where, also deconfliction is hugely important. I think we've seen that, with all these international operations that we've supported, like Emotet, it's deconfliction, coordination, making sure that, everyone knows what the master plan is, and
why don't you just describe for folks, not everyone might be familiar with Emotet, but just what that was.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. So I think Emotet is a perfect, example. I think one of, the biggest operations that we supported, within the last few years. So Emotet, really for the last, I would say 2 or 3 years, was one of the major malware threats. It was a door opener internationally for other cyber criminals to get into networks and, distribute ransomware, for instance. So it was, I think, a perfect example of the crime as a service model, if you will. And if you look at the timeline, we received the first Emotet malware. At the time, it was a banking intrusion in 2014. So that's when Europol received the first message from a partner about that. And it took, that amount of time, 2021 January, to have this really successful operation against that network. And that had a huge impact. So we were really, had the opportunity to bring everything together, do the attribution, do the technical takedown, do something about, the victims, go after the financial transactions, which, if you turn this around and, as Josephine said, that requires experts in different areas, by no means just law enforcement, but definitely, having all these law enforcement partners internationally, being ready, working with, the registries and registrars. All of that has to be timed. I think another important thing, so there's a technical dimension, but there's also a legal dimension. So our partner, Eurojust, which is our counterpart in the EU, dealing with the legal cooperation, has been working very closely with us, because there's equally a lot of legal challenges when you do that at an international scale.
So thank you for that. Is there a current international coalition working on this issue, or is it sort of more informal?
I think, there's obviously a number of coalitions, and I think that's really, really, a good thing, that we have different initiatives and networks coming together to look at that problem. I think for us, one of the platforms that we have is, I want to mention two platforms, and say shout out to Jaya as well, because she's been, a great supporter and friend of Europol and EC3 for almost day one, right? In your previous capacity at KPN and in your new role. But so we have a very strong network of industry partners, and that's, primarily strategically, but that's also where we talk a lot about at strategic level, what can we do, for instance, in the area of ransomware, what can we do, how can we inform policy decisions? But I think really what is quite unique at quite a unique network that we host, and it's called the Joint Cybercrime Action Task Force. So this is a network that we created in 2014. So one of the strengths of Europol and EC3 is that we have, from all the member states, colleagues seconded to the headquarters. So they're physically in the building. And that goes also for the countries that have operational agreements with us. So for instance, the US is currently present, I think, with 10 or 11 different agencies, including the Secret Service and the FBI. So those colleagues are present, on site. But they're not necessarily cybercrime experts, right? So in 2014, I was like, well, it'd be great to have a platform of, cybercrime experts, international experts. And so we established, the Joint Cybercrime Action Task Force. And this is now, I think, quite a unique platform in law enforcement. It's not just, I think we currently have about 18 countries currently present, actively participating. And that just includes not just EU countries, but also the US is there with the FBI Secret Service, Colombia is there, Australia is there, Switzerland, and those people, colleagues, sit together physically, and it's become, I think, one of, it's fair to say, our main platform to prioritize cases, to deconflict, to coordinate, to see, where is, what are the cases that have a high level of success, and what can we do about it, and they're also going, they're going after all sorts of cybercrime cases, but ransomware is on the top because it's such a big threat. So to me, I think that's a very successful platform. They work with industry as well, and then hopefully, at the next level, we can potentially even have, non-law enforcement partners included as well. If we look at, solve some of the legal challenges. But to me, that's a very successful platform. And again, it has to have this international dimension. As you said, Chris, in the beginning, it's the absolute exception that, you have a cybercrime case or ransomware case where everything is just in one country, everything, the infrastructure, the bad guys, the exchanges, obviously that's not the case. It's usually 2, 3, or even more jurisdictions that you have to deal with. And I think, Emotet was a good example. I think, one of the last servers that we had to take down was sitting County, and that was really, one of the last, really the last server. Took just really, really a long time to, be taken down. And that was, technical versus, plus legal challenges. So yes, you have to have that international platform. And that's, I think, one of the ones that is working quite well. There's a trust, environment. There's a mutual understanding of what the common objectives are. And I think that's also very, very important.
Yeah, I'd say, even 20 years ago, I said, if you're a smart cyber criminal of any kind, and even if you're in the house next door, going after the target next door, you're going to route your communications through several different countries to evade detection. So this always ends up being an international problem. Let me ask you one last thing that I think will segue into Jaya too, which is, you talk about partnering with the private sector. This is like the kind of the holy grail that we've talked about for years, the elusive public-private partnership. How can we work with the private sector more effectively? as you said, there's some legal and other issues on sharing information and having an effective task force. But as you also pointed out, it's critical to have those folks involved. Do you have any ideas of how to do that effectively? I know you have to overcome some legal options. Even doing that within one country, say the United States, is hard enough. If you're trying to do it, with multiple countries, that seems to just amplify the difficulty. But at the same time, it's something I think really needs to be done.
Yeah. No, I agree with you. I think it's an ongoing challenge, and I don't have obviously the final solution to that. I think it's, but it is the time now to finally go from what we've been saying for 10, 15 years. What's the solution? Well, we need to work together. We need to share information intelligence, and we've been saying this for years. And I think it's really time to say, well, actually, how do we do that? And who takes the lead? Who takes control of that? What platform do we use? How do we establish those secure channels? And what's the purpose for sharing information? So I think it's great to see all these different initiatives. And I think sometimes, it's just a little bit too much, sort of mushrooming initiatives, too many platforms. And I think that can be confusing, especially, from a law enforcement perspective, but also from an industry perspective, because it's not really clear, who am I sharing that information with? What are they doing with that? And what is it that I'm getting out of that? So I think public-private partnership is, I think, it's hugely important to us. If I can say, well, from a law enforcement perspective, doing investigations, attribution, if you will, that's the gold standard, right? As a prosecutor, you say, well, we know the bad guys, those are the bad guys, we're going after them, get them into jail. But I would say, you could argue, well, the platinum standard is actually to prevent a crime from happening in the first place, right? That's even better. And I think, especially with ransomware, I think there's a huge potential also to focus on prevention and awareness. And I want to really mention, one of our initiatives there in that space, which is the No More Ransom initiative. It's a platform that we established about 5 years ago with, at the time, 2 industry partners, McAfee and Kaspersky and the Dutch police. And really, initially, it was just the idea to have a place where we can put, private keys and some of the tools we had at the time. And fast forward to 2021, we have a platform with 170 partners plus. Jaya is definitely one of the supporters. We have the platforms available in 37 different languages. We have, and that's the key part there, apart from prevention and awareness information, we have currently about more than 100 different tools that can decrypt more than 120 different ransomware families for free. And I think that's a great example where, again, companies, law enforcement agencies from different countries come together, set aside sometimes their, political differences or even ignoring the fact that they might be competitors, but they come together for the greater good to say, this is a useful platform, it has a huge impact. And just to give you a figure, so last year, around the 4-year anniversary, we did a very rough, conservative estimating. It was about $630 million at the time that we had prevented from going into the hands of criminals. And I think that's massive, and it's not just individuals that we've been able to help, but also, companies. And I think that's also important to say, have this, looking at all the different options that we have to go after ransomware. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much, Jaya. I want to hit on that with you too, but let me start. You're the private sector person on the panel, so you're representing the private sector. But so I guess there's a couple questions. First, and I want to also tie into what Philip was saying, but what given the international nature of this crime, as you're looking at this as a business and you're trying to communicate this, the always difficult part of communicating this from the CISO to the other people in the C-suite, to the people who are running various companies. How do you see the nature of this crime from a company perspective? And how do you communicate that to the organization heads so that they actually understand that this is an issue?
To be very frank with you, this is actually not that difficult. I mean, I've been lucky enough to be in a telco and in a security firm, so it should be a no-brainer. But even then, companies are really shitty at learning from their own mistakes. So I think the best place to learn, frankly,
companies are not alone in that. Governments are pretty good at that too.
Right. So the point is that instead of just examining your own area of what went wrong and how do we learn from that, from stuff we messed up ourselves, I think the best place to learn from is look at the rest of the industry, look specifically at your sector, at your competitors. And with ransomware, again, this should be really easy. We're seeing some horrific train wreck like incidents happening here. So there's plenty of why should we care notes based on the disasters that befell other companies.
Mhm.
So for example, if I want to have budget, like let's say I'm a CISO and I'm not at Avast, I'm not at KPN, and I want to have budget to do something structurally about preventing ransomware from coming in and infiltrating, and that's everything from vulnerability management to having solid backup plans, the whole shebang. But if I want to do that, that's going to cost some money. And in order to explain this effectively about what's my return on security investment, the way that you explain this to the C-suite is, there's going to be companies where the C-suite, when it comes to information security, is still dumb as rocks.
Mhm.
So the really simple way to do it is just to talk money and point out, like, I think it was only a few days ago when the largest ransomware payment ever was demanded for Acer, and it was something like 50 million. So Acer's being demanded to pay 50 million for a ransomware attack. And there's apparently, and there's different things depending on where you're reading, there's already been a whole exfil of documents, and some of this may already be leaking. So the potential for that reputational damage, that direct financial impact, the loss to your customer data, I mean, that's huge. So it shouldn't be that hard.
It shouldn't be, but at least in my experience too, it's kind of hard sometimes because there are two categories, or maybe there's more than two categories, frankly, of companies. There are those that are like yours that are involved in these things day to day. I mean, they're either computer security companies or they're telcos or others who see a lot of this, the more tech-oriented companies. And they, by and large, I think, understand this. I'd say financial institutions, by and large, understand this because they've been the brunt of so many attacks. But a lot of other industry, it seems to me that they read the headlines and then they go back. I hate this phrase "wake up call." We're gonna have another wake up call. We have so many wake up calls in the last 20 years that we're like we have a sleeping disorder because we keep falling back asleep. So how do you get those companies who are not in these industries to understand and do really what you're saying, risk management, right? Figure out how this is a risk to them. What can you recommend?
Yeah, because I have to be honest, like even when you can, so your question was, how do you explain this? I think the explanation part about why should we care, why is it important, and why do you need to invest, that those are the things that are more straightforward. But translating that still to action and committing to the less sexy parts of that plan to actually get something implemented, that is still like the long road ahead, because it doesn't matter which company, there's always a bit of technological debt. You have this sunk cost in existing infrastructure and applications, and in order to migrate away from that, in order to embrace something else that you need to add on to that infrastructure, it becomes difficult to do. So I have to say that just because you've convinced them that the problem is important enough to pay attention to doesn't necessarily mean that the mitigation plan is going to be executed flawlessly and on time. And so that's still a challenge. And I think that the way to get them to do this is really baby steps. There are so many ways that we can be doing better and performing better as companies protecting themselves versus the industry, simply because what we're seeing predominantly in this space is, we've been doing this for decades. We've been playing whack-a-mole with all of these groups. And when infrastructure gets taken down, it pops back up again. So we have huge malware campaigns, and working together with law enforcement and with each other, we can take some of them down. We can supply decryption keys, but it's still not as cooperative sometimes, and doesn't seem as rapid in terms of its evolution to pop up a new threat as the criminals are. So I think we need to slowly get better. I mean, the only real competition I've seen so far between the criminal gangs is just recently between Ryuk ransomware and REvil. So you don't really see a lot of competition. And the only reason they're saying is ransomware is better because you're more likely to get your decryption keys when you pay us. So, you're going to recover your data, which is a weird place to compete if you think about it. Who are you selling this advertising to? So I think it's still a challenge to figure out how to go from, I get what you're saying. It's kind of like if I warned you about, high blood pressure and heart disease, you totally buy it. I can make the threat really clear and the steps of what you need to do to get there, but still doing the thing is still really challenging.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely right. Well, do you think that companies and businesses, for years, I think there's also been the alarm sent about nation state activity, theft of intellectual property, things like that. Do you think ransomware represents to them more of an immediate threat? In other words, with those things like theft of intellectual property, you don't actually see your property walking out the door. It's some ethereal nation state that's out there. There's some sense that oh, what can we do? It's a nation state. We're just a poor little company. But with ransomware, they're criminals, and you actually see the money walking out the door. Does this have more effect of raising awareness, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think the motivation is very clearly understood, and the motivation isn't always understood. But I would argue that ransomware is actually that blurry area where you have criminals and nation states happily participating and pretending to be each other. And Kim Jong Un is the perfect example of someone who is really like embracing his cyber criminal self to raise money for his weapons program, according to the UN. So yeah, so I actually think he's like the original gangsta for all things ransomware related. And I think we need to do a lot better job of explaining what exactly the intellectual property stuff looks like, because it's not just a sort of dry piece of IP. We're recovering so much information that is like customer related information and supply chain related. There's also like recent reports, I think it was Graham Cluley, who pointed out that ransomware gangs are deliberately looking for companies that are insured by cybersecurity insurance, which covers ransomware impact, and that the insurers themselves are being targeted to figure out who's your client list. We'll just go after them. We know you'll get paid. There's like a no harm, no foul kind of concept. So, which is really crazy. Insurance will pay it out. It's fine. You'll pay us the ransom. Which is really crazy when you think about it a little bit longer.
The moral hazard problem in reverse, kind of. So
yeah.
So just now keying off of what Philip was saying, and you hit on this a little bit already, but how, from your point of view and what you'd like to see, what's happening, and you've been participating in a lot of these joint efforts, as Philip said, but how can you leverage the private sector in going after these actors? Is it really a more formal partnership with law enforcement and governments, or is it more of an informal one where each does follows their own strengths? What do you think the right solution is?
I honestly think it's so multi-tiered. It's still really difficult sometimes to find the right groups and get them to work together. And it's such a combination of, you still hope that the traditional CERT community is still tightly woven enough that we can still get stuff solved at speed. And that is actually not good enough. I love the CERT community. I mean, I'm a full believer in this way of working, but I think we can do better. So like the company that I work for now at Avast, we really try to actively go after partnerships where we work together with Microsoft, with Kaspersky, with F-Secure, with ESET, with all of the folks that you would traditionally think that we would be competing with McAfee. We don't compete on this area. In this area, we only collaborate to try to get the bad guys. And I think that, we're trying, but we could be doing a better job. It could be even closer. And certainly the ISP community and the telecommunications community and the hosting providers and everyone else that forms this ecosystem, which allows the whack-a-mole to be played, we can be doing better.
Well, let me just ask all the panelists now, does anyone want to comment on anything they've heard? I know we've kind of gone serially. So I'll circle back. Josephine first. I mean, you want to comment on anything else you've heard? And I also like all the panelists to kind of answer this question. Are we doing enough to make it clear that this is a real priority? Is that understood? Are we doing enough? But in the context of that, also want to hear if you have any comments on what the other speakers have said before we turn to other questions that might be coming in from social media. Josephine, what do you think?
Sure. So I think, I live in the United States. I look at cybersecurity policy from a global perspective, but also very much from a US-centric perspective. And I would say it hasn't been a very high priority for US policymakers up until pretty recently, at least sort of watching from the outside, right? And trying to understand where resources are being devoted, where messaging campaigns are being focused. I think, say, the No More Ransom campaign, which Philip brought up, right, is an example of the kind of thing that the United States has not really tried to either attach themselves to or promote. If you look at the US law enforcement resources on what to do if you're the subject of a ransomware attack, there's not a lot of mention of, there are ways of trying to figure out, decryption on your own without paying. So I think in general in the United States, that hasn't been as much of a priority as I might like it to be. The other thing I would say is that there hasn't been a big focus, I think really anywhere, though I'd be curious if others on the panel have other ideas about this, but coming back to what Jaya was talking about in terms of the private sector role, I think we saw like 6 years ago in the United States, coming out of the FCC CISRIC, the Communications Stability, and I should not have tried to elaborate on that acronym because I'm now going to fail, but the Stability, Security, Reliability Group within the FCC, they had started an initiative to think about the role of the ISPs in trying to crack down on bots. And I think, bots are not just a ransomware issue, but they're a big part of what we think about when we think about sort of the infrastructural dependencies of ransomware operators. And so there was this voluntary code of conduct, the ABCs, the anti-bot code that they came up with, and it was going to involve the internet service providers doing some more proactive monitoring of when they saw bot traffic and trying even perhaps to tamp down on some of it and get their customers' machines disinfected and all of that. And that really sort of fell apart for a variety of reasons, never took off. But I think sort of when I think about what are the opportunities for working with the private sector, that's one of the ones that I feel we have not prioritized in a serious way, either in the United States or perhaps in other places. And so I'm curious, Jaya, I know that sort of Avast is not an internet service provider and that's not the part of the private sector that you work in, but I'd be a little curious coming back to your comments of sort of whether you think there are parts of the private sector that countries and governments could do a better job of leveraging and what that might look like.
Oh, heck yeah. So like, let's start with, so I'm not in an ISP now, but like the telco job was totally all full on. And I was also working on, and not a related issue, but it was on DDoSes. And the biggest thing that you saw was we actually have no reason for this problem to exist. We just need to prevent spoofing. And we actually know how to do this. And there are RFCs, which we could all follow and like stop this from happening. And we're, all have exchange points where we can be very clear about who we peer with, and why we allow this type of traffic to go through or not. And so just like that, we know about the problem, but we don't necessarily like fix it. I think there's a lot of stuff that we could be doing better from this perspective, from a government orientation, where like, let's talk about why for a second some of these attacks are still so successful. It's not just about getting people trained to recognize phishing links and don't click on that stuff and prevent that. It's also about like the Acer case. I think it was based on the Microsoft Exchange vulnerability still being present. I'm not sure. I don't know if it's been corroborated, but I believe that was the entry point for which the ransomware got in and became successful in the Acer environment. And like really like vulnerability mitigation timestamps and the time between knowing about a vulnerability, having the exploit available, that time is like next to nothing these days. That time is shortening and shortening. So I think policymakers can do a way better job of trying to assist and enforce some of those things. Like I have to think always when we look at this kind of stuff of the state of Israel, where they actually have a 911 number for reporting cybersecurity incidents, but also have a nationally coordinated vulnerability program. It's awesome sauce. I mean, every country should have that. Every regulator should be able to kind of show this as like, look, this is what we do. This is how we do it. This is when we find it acceptable. And there are no secrets. If you are publicly scannable, this is it. So we want to be able to enforce that there's none of these reachable vulnerabilities. And how you keep the inside of your network is also important, but don't let your skirts peek. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's that's an endemic problem, getting that loop closed. And I think you mentioned the Microsoft Exchange server, which even if that ends up being just espionage, it's not really just, because it was I'd say it was reckless espionage, and it left lots of these computers open to further victimization by ransomware groups, and it's not surprising they're going after it. The other thing I comment on what you said is I think that there are a lot of tools out there no one's really using, and many of these tools are free. I mean, Phil, you mentioned some of the ones that you guys have. I'm not sure how many people are aware of the No More Ransom program. I am, but I've been working in this area a bit, but I think a lot of people aren't, and that's especially the victims. So getting that out there, I think, is important. I'm on the board of a nonprofit called the Center for Internet Security in the U.S. They have a tool, a malicious domain blocking and reporting tool that they've given for free to hospitals here that helps with the issue because it doesn't let you go to these malicious domains. And I think there are things like that out there. But there's a lot more we can do just on the hygiene level. I agree, and making sure that we're closing this loop. Phil, let me go back to you to comment on anything anyone has said so far, and anything else you'd like to add.
Gosh, I've been trying to take notes, because I think there's so many good points that Josephine and Jaya and you have raised. I think, first of all, I mean, one of the things I wanted to mention, and that goes back to one of the first questions you asked, Jaya, is, how do you convince the C-suite? Well, people may or may not know this, but of course, now we see cases where ransomware operators abuse the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which per se is EU-centric, but of course, if you're a non-EU organization that processes data of EU citizens, it equally applies to you. And sort of from a data protection standpoint, the fact that you have ransomware attack, even if the data is not leaked, that usually needs to be reported, if the GDPR applies to you. So there's that additional fee. And of course, again, criminals have, realized that. So what they do now is this double dip attack. They're going to exploit the data. They're going to threaten to publish it, just to increase because then you may face, just not, the ransomware costs, the costs linked to reputational loss, plus, potential GDPR fine. So it's sort of a perfect storm, if you will. And I think that's a problem. And you see really also how criminals, become very, innovative in that space. And I think the other point that Jaya mentioned, it's actually, it boggles the mind that we have now a situation where, cybercrime groups have like a PR person that says, by the way, during the pandemic, we decided not to attack hospitals because we're not that bad, and you're almost like, well, thank you very much, and we're really happy. I mean, it's just, and the sense of impunity that is out there among those criminals, it's just, it boggles the mind. The other point I was to mention, which is, it's almost a little bit philosophical, but, when you talk about, when I say, well, we work with the FBI. So when I say Europol works with the FBI, Europol works with Interpol, what are we saying? Well, actually, there's a person in Interpol that speaks to a person at Europol. And if you're lucky, there's a good chemistry, they like each other, and, some things is happening. If they don't, then, guess what? Two large organizations are not really working together. So there, it's as Jaya also said, there's this multi-layer, and Josephine, I think, referred to that as well. It's a multi-layer problem, and there are a lot of these easy solutions out there. And then, people say, well, if you say, well, the only thing you have to do is, have an asset register and do proper patch and vulnerability management, and you're good. Usually, those are people who've never worked in that kind of setting. So it's really difficult. But I think it's when it comes to that interaction, it is that really complex thing, and it needs something that needs to be nurtured and needs to be moderated. And what helps is, based on our experiences, to have to identify the common objectives, the common the incentives that work for both sides. Why are we doing this? What's the benefit? And yes, think about DMARC. I mean, I know the Global Cyber Alliance is doing a great job promoting DMARC, but it's out there. There's so many solutions out there. And as maybe as a last point, and that's also quite interesting, and of course, especially for law enforcement, we have a paper out there, if you're interested, together with Eurojust. It's called The Common Challenges in Combating Cybercrime. We're talking about the loss of data, loss of location, legal challenges, international cooperation. But a lot of times, you have great solutions. There's a large telco company that has a great in-house developed solution to go after botnets. But basically, they're saying, well, with the implementation of DNS over HTTPS or oblivious DNS, that's not working anymore. So a lot of times you have these, strong encryption. Perfect. We want to have strong encryption, but I think ransomware is the prime example of, the criminal abuse of encryption, not just to hide their communication infrastructure, but it's obviously actively part of their attack vector. So a lot of times that's also something where we say, how do we, and I hate the word balance because every cryptologist will say there's no balance, and it's true. But it's great to have all these privacy enhancing technologies, strong encryption that will help us. But at the same time, it will also have a negative impact, not just on investigations, but also on a lot of those tools that are meant to increase cybersecurity. So it is, and I'm there, a multifaceted problem with unfortunately no easy answers.
I just say to the audience, if you want to submit questions through social media, please do. But we're going to continue conversing among ourselves until we get some. So, Jaya,
Oh,
it looks like you have your, do you have your hand up?
yes,
Or
I do. I do have my hand up.
go, please.
So, no, I was
I was
at
just going to
a,
make the point before you do that even within a country, sometimes law enforcement agencies don't like each other. So.
no, but no, I wanted to say something because I was at a conference. It was a Europol conference actually, and it was a few years ago. And I don't remember, Philip, who said this, but it was a wonderful quote. And it said, it was about, I think it was about, it was either of a ransomware campaign or a malware takedown or darknet marketplace. But the best thing I heard was it was all these agencies cooperating. And the person who was speaking said, it's amazing what we can accomplish when no one cares who gets the credit. And I thought it was so defining because that's part of the problem as well in the private industry to kind of figure out, okay, so what went wrong and how do we fix it and whatever. But, you know, let's be honest, if we, and I won't go down the slippery slope of arguing the encryption thing, you know how I stand on this, which is all encrypted all the way and we should encrypt absolutely everything, but okay. So we'll go down there, but I feel like I have to say that. But I do think that we need to get way better at finding those points where there's this cooperation possible, and this shared, like, clear incentivization system of why we cooperate. Because I think also for Josephine's question before about how do you get these players to work with you, and very often there is a legislative response like a GDPR saying you got to protect customer data, but this also leads to like non-reportability of some of the things, direct going to payments, and even when we counsel like our own customers and everyone else never ever pay, there is no such thing as honor amongst thieves. It doesn't work that way. They still like that, that's their first inclination. So I think we need to have a better incentivization system centrally and better sets of communication to like let it travel down the pipe basically to customers and other supply chain stakeholders.
And I think I take your point. If we're trying to solve the encryption debate here, we'd be here for several more days. And I've seen all sides of that. But you know, I do think you know, how you go about this, how you target, as you say, I think is really important. Josephine, did you have a comment on, you know, it's been a little while since you talked because other people will comment on your comments, and do you have a comment back at this point?
Yeah, I wanna respond to the question of sort of people paying, because I think this is also an area where the US and the US law enforcement community, perhaps in particular, has not always been very clear, has not always sort of known exactly what their message was. I have my own opinions about this, which is that sort of one of the ways that you could make ransomware less profitable and therefore something that people would be less likely to undertake is if there was a really clear, strong line against paying. Though I understand why that's also hard. There was famously in the States a scandal 5-6 years ago now where an FBI agent said at a conference, you know, usually we just tell people they should pay the ransom. And there were a lot of stories written about that and a lot of sort of retrenchment from the FBI about what it was that they actually wanted to say. One of the things that I think about a lot in this space, and again, I'd be curious for sort of what Philip and Jaya think, is that part of what's been hard in the States, at least, is that when we shift to thinking about ransomware from, say, thinking about payment card fraud, you lose these really sort of large, powerful companies like MasterCard and Visa bearing the costs, right? So once upon a time, those were the entities that had a lot at stake in saying we need to crack down on cybercrime, we need to, you know, invest in better technology and chip-enabled cards, whatever else. And as we see this shift to ransomware, there's more and more of sort of individual end users who are bearing the costs, whether they're individual people or individual organizations. There's less of a sense that we've sort of protected them from bearing the direct costs of this type of crime. And that's meant both in policy circles that there's a less strong lobby against sort of ransomware and a less strong lobby saying we need to do something about this. And it's also meant that there's a less sort of well-coordinated, less well-resourced group trying to deal with some of the hygiene issues, trying to think about the technology. So I'm curious sort of when we think about this from the policy perspective, are there vocal proponents in the private sector, in the lobbying space, who are sort of trying to encourage governments to take this more seriously that you see, or is this really something governments have to come around to themselves as a priority?
So in answering that, and just I only say this because we're beginning to run short on time. It's been a very lively discussion. We do have one question from the social media. I'll read it to you, but as you answer these questions as we go forward, just keep this in mind. And it's for the panelists, not individually specified. If we can get more specific, please, what exactly prevents a more rapid ability to keep pace with the criminal gangs? They are constantly changing, adapting, and retooling immediately after a large takedown. Is it an authorities question? What specifically needs to change? So as you answer other questions, keep that question in mind and try to answer that. And on your point, I think, yeah, I think there's a number of efforts to raise the awareness of this issue and make it compete with some of these national security issues. There was, I think this task force that was set up here, the ransomware task force, is one effort to do that. There was, efforts around cybercrime, but let me throw it open to the group. And let me also, so that was the social media question. Let me also couple with this: is there a role for doing things like capacity building? I mean, my group, the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise on Cyber Expertise, tries to get countries to get up to speed more, to have the capability. Is there a role there? So answer whatever you want, but those are two things I put on the table. We have 7 minutes. Phil?
I can start. No, I think, so that was a good question. It's true. I mean, when you have sort of centralized payment processor and it's sort of clear, who has to bear, the losses, then, you could argue, well, that makes them, an easier, that's an easier case for lobbying. But I think if you turn this around, I think, if you take credit card fraud, affecting, for instance, the airline industry, I think, the individual case is a classic example, if you will, of high volume, low value crime, right? The initial crime, a few €100. And what we actually did there, we established what we call the Global Airline Action Task Action Days. So getting, again, that international coalition together, and we realized if you put them all together, they're actually huge. So again, sometimes it's just a matter of tallying those losses to create that lobbying. But potentially there is an issue there. But I feel right now, given the fact that a lot of those attacks now go into affecting critical infrastructure, affecting the healthcare sector, I think there is probably a lot of attention now, because potentially more from a cybersecurity angle, saying, well, it's just too risky, if a critical infrastructure goes down or a hospital, goes down, which of course has costs, but that has a real life, affects you and me, and can be life threatening. So I think that is certainly changing. I think just as a last comment, the point you made, I think what can change, I think one of the things that can change, is the basics. Again, it's not just the 0 days, it's the 1,000 days, things that have been around for years and have not been patched. I think a focus on victims, what can we do to be more sort of creative and actually, doing something with the infected machines. But I think also, as a last point, the insurance industry, I think, can play a really positive role in that space, not just paying out the ransom, but really say, well, you have to have those measures in place, before we do that. So that's just, a few thoughts from my side. Thanks, Chris.
Jaya, why don't we go to you next?
Yeah, so actually, I think one of the really good positive things that I have to say that happened with credit card fraud is, we had at a certain moment a degree of intolerance by Visa and MasterCard and the payment providers, and they set up the PCI DSS scheme. So if you were a processor of more than a certain threshold of transactions, you had to be compliant to PCI DSS. Otherwise, you just couldn't hang out and pay for stuff with credit cards. Pretty annoying. Yeah. So I think that we're looking at something that would be not comparable, because actually you have, maybe what Philip said is actually spot on, in the sense that you've got this enormously spread out victim base. If you just indeed would tally all of those losses up, it has serious consequences from an economic kind of perspective per country. So you would argue that even though it's so spread out, because it's an international problem, if we could conglomerate all of it, it would be clear that we need also international cooperation and action. To go back for 1 second, that critical infrastructure thing, I have to tell you, that is so not a joke. When we started the lockdown after COVID-19 last year in March, one of the first institutions that was hacked was the hospital in Brno in the Czech Republic. And at Avast, we actually worked on that case, and it's really horrific that we're talking about now, a activity that is genuinely going to cost loss of life. And it goes beyond what we saw with WannaCry. You know, it really is going to cross that barrier. And I think at that point, I can't think of anything else that would more easily compel us to say there's not just a dollar price tag anymore. It's not just an economic number that's affected here, but we're really talking about something that could cause both manufacturing and hospitals, places where infrastructure is difficult to change without losing certification and ability to continue their production processes. I think we really got to look at that. And then finally, to answer that question that came in, what could we be doing better? Well, again, that evolution, that ability to copy TTPs, that is really something that is a sort of hallmark characteristic of these different ransomware groups. And what I do think is, look, I got to be honest, Christopher, and Philip knows this as well. Like, I was part of the EC3 Communication Service Providers Group. Now I'm part of the Internet Security Group. We're also part of the Cyber Threat Alliance. We're also trying to work with the Cyber Coalition. Like, if I didn't have a day job, I would be in meetings all day that still help with my day. It's insane. Yeah. So if someone says like, hey, let's go to one more committee, let's set up one more place to share information, I'm going to go nuts. Yeah. So we definitely need the human side to work. So you need to work with people you can trust. And like the companies that I think that are doing a great job are still companies like Microsoft, you know, and I just think we need to still get a little bit better, like still notch up our game, share more, do more, but do it more automated, make it more accessible, maybe share detections. And only then will we really be able to be on the same pace as these criminal gangs.
Josephine, over to you. We're running out of time. I don't know if we're allowed to go over or not. If someone can email or chat me and let me know, because one of the questions that's come in, which I think is a good one too, when you've alluded to it, and maybe Josephine, you could take a little chop on this, is should we prohibit payments, or how do we curtail payments, or how do we make them more difficult? Is that something we should look at, or is that too disruptive?
So since you're asking me, and since I have to be brief, which is going to allow us to avoid fighting about this for 20 minutes, I'll say, yeah, I think we probably should take a serious look at prohibiting payments. I think there will be exceptions. I think there will be times and places where it makes sense to everybody. This is what we need to do if lives are on the line. But I think that sort of the approach the US government has taken so far, where they say, like, you can't make payments to certain groups that have been designated as enemies or terrorists, is not actually helpful for ransomware, because nobody knows who they're paying, or if they don't want to find out, they can certainly claim they didn't know. And I think that if we want to actually sort of make a real difference, I don't know how much of a difference a ban on this would make, but I think it would potentially be at least a much clearer signal than we have right now, of sort of, here is what we tell you to do. Do not pay. Don't just not pay because you might not get your data back. Don't pay because it's illegal, because you're funding criminal activity, you're potentially funding adversary governments and nations. Yeah, I think that's worth really seriously considering.
All right, we have run out of time. I'm told we can go 1 or 2 minutes over. So, on that last point, if the other two of you want to make a very short comment, then we're going to wrap up. Does anyone else want to throw in their comment on that? Yeah.
I'm gonna let Philip take the Parthian shot, but just to be really quick about this, I genuinely think it's not just about stopping payments, right? I don't know if that's so thing, but what I really liked was the way that Europol and Interpol went after the darknet markets. I think that drives attention and focus and deliberate activity towards one actor, towards one group. And I think that if we would just kind of peel the onion, who's causing the most damage, and go after them one by one, and just peel the onion with the same groups that we already work with, that would be way better.
All right, Phil, you get the last word before I close it down.
No, I think I have nothing really substantial to add. It was just, I think I support what Jaya and Josephine said. I think the really point is, let's come together, walk the talk. I mean, just to use that expression, we need to become better in actually doing what we're talking about, cooperation, sharing information, and really have an impact.
So just hands up or hands down, how many people think in 3 years we'll be better off and have a handle on this? Anyone in favor? Kind of half raised hand. So it's still a tough problem. And I want to thank all of you for all of your time. Thank the audience for listening. This has been a very really lively and rich discussion. So thank you for this. And obviously these issues will continue. As I mentioned, you should look forward to future events from IST. But thank everyone for participating today, and look forward to actually making some progress on this.